Well, hello, everybody. I thought I'd take the time to walk you through a few of the main points from the blood analysis lab. From a technological standpoint, that one's been pretty tricky. I'm actually not going to count the blood analysis lab because there have just been way too many technical issues involved, and I feel like I can summarize this stuff pretty well and kind of give you the main points that you need to know. These blood analysis tests that I had you walk through in the simulation, primarily the really important take-home messages had to deal with the abundance of red blood cells and the hemoglobin that those red blood cells tend to carry. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing that you had to measure in the first test was a quantity called hematocrit. And when a doctor measures hematocrit, like you see on the screen, they're measuring the percentage of red blood cells in your blood. Typically, this will be somewhere just under 45%, as plasma makes up about 55% of the blood, and about 99% of the blood cells in your blood are actually red blood cells. They're by far the most abundant cells in your bloodstream. And this hematocrit, therefore, is a really important number because red blood cells are tasked with carrying oxygen to body tissues. So lower than normal numbers can be a really big problem. A lower than normal hematocrit will indicate a condition called anemia that you're probably pretty familiar with. Higher than normal values indicate a condition called polycythemia, which may be entirely new to you. So we'll explain that just a little bit in a minute. So there are a number of factors that can affect one's hematocrit, the percentage of red blood cells in your blood. The first is biological sex. And so male sex hormones, androgens, it turns out they actually promote more production of red blood cells than female sex hormones. And this is due to their specific influence on a hormone called erythropoietin, EPO for short, secreted by the kidneys. EPO is a hormone that influences the production of red blood cells in bone marrow. The more EPO that gets secreted, the more red blood cells you make. EPO has actually been used as a performance enhancer by endurance athletes, marathoners, cyclists, things like that. Lance Armstrong in particular had a rather infamous sort of drug ring involving the injection of EPO among his teammates at the Tour de France. And EPO, if injected artificially, will promote the production of more red blood cells, just as the naturally occurring EPO secreted by the kidneys would. So that's certainly one factor. Altitude is another factor. You'll often hear about, in those same endurance athletes, cyclists and marathoners and things like that, a lot of those athletes are actually preparing currently for the Olympics to be held in Tokyo this summer. And living at higher altitude promotes the production of red blood cells and results in a higher hematocrit. That is an adaptation to be able to handle the decrease in available oxygen at those altitudes. I have ultra runner friends who actually bought a hypoxic tent that allows them to sleep at a lower level of oxygen, just basically suck some of the air out of the room to allow them to adapt to higher altitudes and lower oxygen levels without actually living at higher altitudes. This particular friend that I'm thinking about lives in Newburyport and sleeps in this tent that simulates living, say, in Colorado, where she may run races. And so before a big race, you'll often hear about athletes moving to higher altitudes to be able to build up those red blood cells so that then when they come down to sea level to race, they have all this extra hemoglobin and therefore all this extra oxygen. Dehydration can also affect hematocrit because as a percentage of the total volume of blood, if there's less water, that means there's more cells and more red blood cells. You can often have a decreased hematocrit after significant blood loss. If you have an accident, if you lose a lot of blood, if you haven't yet had it transfused back, that would tend to decrease the hematocrit. illness or infections. That's certainly been in the news this last year. That would increase the number of white blood cells, and because there are more white blood cells, there is a lower percentage of red blood cells in comparison. Lung and heart disease also increases blood plasma. You have a difficulty often getting rid of fluid in your blood, which leads to increases in blood pressure and decreases in hematocrit because you have more fluid in the blood compared to cells. And finally, there's a condition called polycythemia vera, which results in the bone marrow making too many red blood cells, and that increases their percentage in the blood. So, now we're on to hemoglobin. Now we're getting a little more specific here. There are a lot of parallels. You'll notice that a lot of the factors that affect hematocrit, the overall percentage of red blood cells, also affect the amount of hemoglobin in the blood. And there are relationships between the two that we're not going to get into too much here. But needless to say, hemoglobin is one of the most important molecules in the body. It is the protein that attaches to red blood cells and carries oxygen to tissues. And the beauty of it is that it carries oxygen very loosely. It grabs onto it tightly enough to bring it through the bloodstream, but then easily gives it up to cells as it passes through in the bloodstream. And therefore, it's perfectly adapted to its function. So, just to jump right into some of the factors that affect those levels. So, those same athletes that are currently training for the Olympics, or the soccer players that are currently training for the European Championships, or whatever, those finely tuned athletes, because they have trained their heart and their entire cardiovascular system, and because their kidneys secrete more of this EPO hormone to produce more red blood cells in response to the increased load, they tend to have higher levels in hemoglobin than untrained individuals. And of course, that allows them to access more oxygen for their muscles to fuel long efforts. So when you work out, you're not just training your muscles, you're not just training your heart, you're also promoting the production of more red blood cells, which in turn leads to increases in performance. Now, anemia is a condition that is marked by lower than normal levels of hemoglobin. But that really only scratches the surface because anemia has many causes. The most common that we hear about is iron deficiency anemia. And that is very common, and it's mostly caused by deficits in the diet. Iron and vitamin C that is required to absorb iron into the blood are two things that can result in a lower than normal iron level in the diet. I actually was diagnosed with anemia a number of years ago before I gave up meat, and that was really the one time in the last 20 years that I've eaten red meat regularly. Red meat is rather famously high in iron in addition to leafy green vegetables and other sources, and so a diet higher than iron usually can reverse the effects of iron deficiency anemia. There's another disorder called hemolytic anemia. Hemolytic actually refers to the destruction of red blood cells, and so this is a disorder in which red blood cells are destroyed faster than they're made. And this disorder can be inherited or it can be acquired later in life. Sickle cell anemia is one that you may have heard of. It is a genetic disorder passed on by your parents in which red blood cells, instead of being the nice fluffy donuts that they normally are that carry oxygen very well, they take this sort of flattened, sort of sickle shape, almost like a flat frisbee. And this shape increases the possibility of clotting, and it decreases the ability of these cells to carry oxygen. So it can be very, very dangerous and difficult to manage. And finally, there's a condition called aplastic anemia, which results from the bone marrow simply not being able to make enough red blood cells. All of your blood cells are made in your bone marrow, and if there's some defect in the bone marrow, so for example, some sort of bone cancer could cause aplastic anemia, in which bone marrow can't make enough red blood cells, resulting in anemia. So I hope that this is helpful. I figured in light of our tech issues, I would record a quick video to kind of summarize what we're looking at here. Hopefully this will help you in future assessments, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.